Most people think history changes in giant moments, massive armies, famous kings, world-shaking battles. But sometimes history turns because of a message carried across dark water by a handful of survivors after everyone else is gone. In the fall of 1274, Japan wasn't expecting a war for survival. The islands had lived in relative isolation for generations. Power struggles happened within the country, sure, but the idea of a massive foreign invasion felt distant, almost unreal. The samurai trained for honor, loyalty, and individual combat. They fought for their lords, for reputation, for legacy, not for the survival of the entire nation. Across the sea, though, a storm had already formed. Kublai Khan ruled the largest land empire the world had ever seen. His forces stretched across Asia, from the frozen steppes to the rich cities of China. Entire kingdoms had collapsed before his armies. Some surrendered at the mere rumor of Mongol banners. Others resisted and vanished from history. Japan was one of the few places left that hadn't bowed. Years earlier, envoys had arrived with a simple demand: submit as a vassal state or face invasion. To the Mongols, this was routine diplomacy. To Japan's ruling samurai government, it was an insult that cut deeper than any blade. Submission meant dishonor. Silence was their answer. Kublai Khan interpreted that silence exactly how you'd expect. He ordered the creation of a fleet unlike anything East Asia had ever seen. Shipbuilders worked relentlessly in Korean ports. Soldiers were drawn from Mongol cavalry, Chinese infantry, and Korean sailors. Supplies filled the hulls, horses were loaded aboard, weapons stacked high. It wasn't just an army, it was a floating declaration that resistance would be crushed. By the time the fleet sailed, the sea itself seemed crowded with ships. Their first target wasn't mainland Japan. It was a small island sitting between Korea and Kyushu, Tsushima. Quiet, rural, strategically important, and dangerously exposed. On that island lived a man named Sukekuni, the local deputy governor. He was elderly by warrior standards, but still every bit a samurai. His life had been shaped by duty, loyalty to his clan, responsibility for the people under his protection. The kind of man who understood that leadership meant standing at the front when trouble came. And trouble was coming faster than anyone imagined. One morning, lookouts scanning the horizon noticed something strange. At first, it looked like a dark smudge where the sky met the water. Then it grew, and grew, and kept growing until it became impossible to mistake. Ships. Not a handful, not dozens, hundreds. Masts packed so tightly they looked like a forest rising out of the ocean. Sails stretching across the horizon. The sea itself seemed to move. Word spread quickly across Tsushima. Farmers stopped their work. Families gathered their children. Fear traveled faster than the ships themselves. Tsukekuni didn't need anyone to explain what this meant. This wasn't a raid. This was the invasion they'd been warned about for years, finally arriving at his shore. He took stock of his forces. The number was brutally simple. Around 80 mounted samurai and their retainers. That was it. No hidden reserves, no nearby reinforcements, no time to call for help from mainland Japan. 80 men against an invasion force numbering in the thousands. Logically, surrender made sense. It could save lives, preserve the island, avoid pointless bloodshed. Any strategist looking purely at numbers would call resistance suicidal. But samurai culture didn't revolve around survival. It revolved around honor, duty, and obligation. For Sukekuni, this wasn't a question of winning. It was a question of responsibility. If he surrendered without a fight, the island would fall anyway, and his people would know their leader chose safety over duty. If he resisted, he might die. His men would almost certainly die. But their stand would mean something. It would send a message to the invaders, to Japan, and to history itself. So he made the only decision he believed he could live with. They would fight. As night approached, Mongol forces began landing on the beaches of Tsushima. Fires flickered along the shoreline, orders echoed in unfamiliar languages, armor clattered, horses snorted in the dark. The sound of thousands of soldiers preparing for battle carried inland like distant thunder. Before the clash began, Sukekuni made one final attempt at diplomacy. An envoy was sent forward, hoping to negotiate or at least buy time. The response came in a sudden, brutal hiss of arrows. No words, no negotiation, just violence. The message couldn't have been clearer. This invasion wouldn't be stopped with diplomacy. According to later accounts, something eerie happened that night. A nearby shrine dedicated to the war god caught fire. Flames rose into the darkness, casting long shadows across the land. Within the smoke, white birds were seen circling before flying away into the night sky. Some interpreted it as an omen, others as a warning. Sukekuni reportedly saw it as confirmation. Whatever fate awaited them, it had already been decided. At dawn, the samurai prepared. Armor was tightened, bowstrings checked, swords secured at their sides, horses restless beneath them. These weren't men expecting to return home. They knew exactly what waited on that beach. Still, none of them fled. They rode out together toward Komoda Beach, where the Mongol army had established its foothold. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in soft light that felt completely at odds with the violence about to unfold. What happened next wasn't just a battle, it was a collision between two entirely different worlds. For the samurai, warfare was deeply personal. A warrior announced his name and lineage, declaring his identity before engaging in combat. Skill, bravery, and individual reputation defined victory. Archery from horseback, precise sword strikes, controlled duels. This was the battlefield they understood. The Mongols fought differently. Their strength wasn't individual glory, it was coordination, discipline, formation. They moved as a single machine. Infantry locked shields together. Archers fired in synchronized volleys. War drums pounded out rhythms that guided their advance and shook the morale of their enemies. When the samurai launched their first attack, they did it the way they always had. Arrows flew from horseback with deadly accuracy. Several Mongol soldiers fell immediately. For a brief moment, it looked like skill might offset numbers. Then, the Mongol response began. A storm of arrows darkened the air, not aimed at individuals, aimed at everything. Horses, riders, ground. The sheer volume made precision irrelevant. It was overwhelming. And then came something the samurai had never experienced before. Explosions. Small projectiles arced through the air and burst with thunderous cracks upon impact. Smoke, fire, fragments tearing through armor and flesh. These primitive gunpowder bombs weren't just weapons, they were psychological shockwaves. Horses panicked instantly. Carefully organized cavalry charges dissolved into chaos. The noise alone shattered concentration. The battlefield filled with smoke, screams, and confusion. This wasn't the ritualized combat the samurai had trained for. This was total war. Still, they didn't break. Despite the unfamiliar weapons and impossible odds, the samurai pressed forward. When they closed the distance and the fight became hand-to-hand, their training showed. Blades flashed, armor split. Individual Mongol soldiers found themselves facing warriors who had spent their entire lives mastering the art of combat. Several chronicles describe samurai cutting through multiple enemies in rapid succession. Whether the numbers are exaggerated or not, one thing is certain: the defenders fought with terrifying intensity. Sukekuni himself reportedly led repeated charges, riding directly into the thickest fighting. He wasn't trying to survive, he was trying to buy time. Every minute the Mongols were forced to fight here was another minute Japan had to prepare. But courage has limits when numbers don't. Wave after wave of Mongol troops reinforced the beachhead. The samurai grew exhausted, horses fell, arrows ran low. The defenders were slowly pushed back, step by bloody step. What started as a determined resistance turned into a desperate last stand. By midday, the outcome was unavoidable. Surrounded and outnumbered, Sukekuni gathered the few men still fighting beside him. There would be no retreat, no surrender, only one final charge, straight into the heart of the invading army. Not because it would change the result, because it would define the story. They lowered their lances, drew their swords, and rode forward together into a wall of enemies. And in that moment, the fate of 80 men became something far larger than a lost battle. It became a warning that somehow would still have to cross the sea before it was too late. By the time the final charge ended, Komoda Beach was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. The sounds of clashing steel had faded, replaced by the crackle of burning buildings and the distant shouts of occupying soldiers. The last of Sukekuni's warriors had fallen where they stood, surrounded by enemies who seemed to stretch endlessly across the shoreline. From a military standpoint, the battle was over almost as quickly as it began. Tsushima had been crushed, its defenders wiped out, its towns left vulnerable. But history rarely hinges on who wins the first fight. It hinges on who hears about it in time. Amid the chaos, smoke, and slaughter, a small group of survivors slipped away from the island. Not warriors charging into legend, just desperate men carrying something far more powerful than swords: information. They found a small boat, barely suited for open water, and pushed into the sea under the cover of confusion. Behind them, their homes burned. Ahead of them lay miles of cold, uncertain ocean. They weren't fleeing to save themselves. They were racing to save Japan. The journey across the water was brutal. Waves slammed against the fragile boat. Every distant sail could have meant Mongol patrols. Every hour that passed increased the risk that the Mongol invasion fleet would reach mainland Japan first. Because if the Mongols arrived without warning, the consequences would be catastrophic. Japan's defenses weren't designed for a coordinated foreign invasion. Samurai forces were spread across regions, loyal to individual lords. Mobilization took time. Fortifications along the coast were minimal. Strategy still leaned heavily on traditional combat customs rather than large-scale defensive warfare. If the Mongol fleet appeared suddenly at Hakata Bay with thousands of troops ready to land, they might overwhelm Kyushu before the shogunate even understood what was happening. That tiny boat carried the only chance to prevent that surprise. When the survivors finally reached the mainland, exhausted and shaken, their message spread with shocking speed. The Mongols are here. Tsushima has fallen. The invasion has begun. At the Kamakura shogunate's headquarters, the warning hit like a thunderclap. This wasn't rumor anymore. It wasn't diplomacy or distant threats. The largest empire on Earth had launched a real invasion, and it was already moving toward Japan's heartland. Suddenly, everything changed. Messengers were dispatched in all directions. Samurai were ordered to mobilize. Coastal regions braced for attack. Leaders who had once debated politics now focused on survival. And most importantly, they had something priceless: time. Time to gather forces, time to rethink their tactics, time to prepare for a kind of warfare Japan had never faced before. Meanwhile, the Mongol fleet continued its advance. After securing Tsushima, they moved on to Iki Island. There, the story repeated itself in grim fashion. Local defenders resisted, were overwhelmed, and the island fell after fierce fighting. Again, the Mongols left destruction behind them. From a strategic perspective, the invasion was proceeding exactly as planned. Step by step, the Mongols were clearing the path toward Kyushu. Their commanders expected the mainland to fall just as quickly. After all, their empire had crushed far larger and richer territories. Why would Japan be any different? But when the fleet finally approached Hakata Bay, the Mongols encountered something they hadn't expected: preparation. Instead of an unguarded coastline, they saw organized defenses. Samurai forces had gathered in significant numbers. Defensive positions had been established along likely landing points. The element of total surprise, the Mongols' greatest advantage, was gone, all because a handful of survivors escaped Tsushima. The first clashes on the mainland were fierce and confusing. The Mongols still relied on their disciplined formations, coordinated archery, and explosive weapons. Their tactics remained effective, especially in open engagements. But the Japanese had already begun adapting. They avoided relying purely on ritual duels. Units worked together more deliberately. Archers focused on disrupting formations rather than seeking individual glory. Commanders paid closer attention to terrain and defensive positioning. And as night fell, the Japanese introduced something unexpected of their own: small boat raids. Under cover of darkness, groups of samurai launched daring attacks against the anchored Mongol ships. They boarded vessels, set fires, cut down isolated soldiers, and vanished back into the night before large forces could respond. These weren't massive battles. They were relentless harassment. Sleep became impossible for the invaders. Supplies grew harder to protect. Every shadow on the water threatened another sudden assault. For the first time in the campaign, the Mongol advance slowed. Then, nature stepped in. As the fleet remained in Hakata Bay, weather conditions began to shift. Winds strengthened. Waves grew restless. What started as rough seas turned into something far worse. A violent storm tore across the bay. Ships smashed into one another in the darkness. Anchors dragged, hulls splintered against rocks and shoreline. Horses panicked below deck. Soldiers were thrown into the churning water weighed down by armor. The storm didn't just damage the fleet, it shattered the invasion's momentum. Many vessels were destroyed outright. Others were badly damaged, forcing the Mongol commanders to withdraw what remained of their forces rather than risk complete annihilation. Japan had survived the first invasion, not through a single decisive battle, not through overwhelming military superiority, but through a chain of events that began with 80 samurai choosing to stand and fight, long enough for word to escape. Back in Japan, that story spread quickly. The tale of Sukekuni and his outnumbered warriors became more than just news. It became inspiration, proof that resistance mattered, proof that even a doomed stand could shape the outcome of a war. For the samurai class, it reinforced the very ideals their culture was built on: duty before survival, honor before fear, sacrifice for something greater than oneself. But the Mongols weren't finished. Kublai Khan saw the failed invasion not as a defeat, but as an unfinished task. Plans for a second, even larger assault began almost immediately. More ships, more soldiers, more preparation. Japan understood what that meant. The next time, the storm might not come. So the country prepared in ways it never had before. Coastal defenses were strengthened, stone walls were constructed along vulnerable shorelines. Samurai forces trained for coordinated group tactics rather than purely individual combat. Patrols monitored the seas constantly. They were no longer a nation caught off guard. They were a nation waiting. And when the second Mongol invasion finally came in 1281, it dwarfed the first. Massive fleets approached from multiple directions, carrying tens of thousands of troops. On paper, it looked unstoppable. But this time, Japan was ready to fight a defensive war. The Mongols struggled to establish a foothold. Japanese forces resisted fiercely along fortified coastlines. Supply lines stretched thin. Coordination between the separate Mongol fleets proved difficult. Days turned into weeks, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. And then, once again, the sky darkened. Another massive typhoon roared across the sea. Stronger than the first, more destructive. Ships were hurled against each other like toys. Entire sections of the fleet vanished beneath towering waves. Chaos swallowed the invasion force almost overnight. By the time the storm passed, the dream of conquering Japan had drowned in the ocean. The Mongol Empire would never attempt another invasion, and the legend of divine winds, kamikaze, would echo through Japanese history for centuries. But long before the storms, before the walls, before the organized resistance, there had been a beach, a small island, and 80 samurai who knew they couldn't win and fought anyway. Long after the storms faded and the broken ships disappeared beneath the sea, Japan was left with something far more powerful than victory. A story. Not just about survival, but about sacrifice. Because when people later spoke about the Mongol invasions, they didn't begin with the typhoons. They didn't begin with the stone walls or the defensive strategies. They began with Tsushima, with the moment a small island faced the greatest empire on earth and refused to kneel. In pure military terms, the defenders of Tsushima lost everything. Their island fell, their homes burned, their garrison was wiped out. Nothing about the battle looked like success on a map. But history isn't only written in territory gained or lost. Sometimes it's written in time bought. The stand at Komoda Beach forced the Mongols to fight earlier than planned. It delayed their advance, disrupted their rhythm, and, most importantly, allowed word of the invasion to reach the mainland before the fleet arrived. That warning transformed Japan from a divided, unprepared nation into a mobilized one. Without that warning, Hakata Bay might have been defenseless. Without preparation, the Mongols could have landed in force. Without resistance, Japan's history might have taken a completely different path. Instead, the country rallied. And at the center of that rallying cry was the image of Sukekuni and his 80 warriors. Over time, their last stand evolved from historical event into cultural symbol. Stories spread among samurai families, passed from generation to generation. The details grew sharper, the courage larger, the meaning deeper. They became an example of what the warrior's path truly meant. Not winning every battle, not surviving at any cost, but standing firm when duty calls, even if the outcome is certain. This idea helped shape what would later be formalized as Bushido, the moral code associated with the samurai. Loyalty, honor, courage, self-sacrifice. The belief that integrity mattered more than life itself. Whether every detail of the Tsushima story was perfectly preserved didn't really matter. What mattered was what people believed it represented. A reminder that the smallest group can influence the largest outcome. A reminder that resistance can echo far beyond the battlefield. A reminder that courage isn't measured by victory, but by the willingness to stand when defeat is guaranteed. For Japan, the Mongol invasions became a defining historical memory. The storms were remembered as divine protection, the famous kamikaze, or divine wind. But even divine winds needed something to protect. They needed a nation that refused to surrender. They needed warriors willing to hold the line long enough for fate to intervene. Centuries later, the story still carried weight. It influenced literature, military thinking, and national identity. During later periods of conflict, leaders would invoke the spirit of those early defenders as proof that determination and unity could overcome overwhelming odds. Because the real power of the Tsushima stand wasn't in what those 80 men destroyed. It was in what they inspired. Think about it. 80 men couldn't stop an empire. They couldn't win the battle. They couldn't save their island. But they changed the timeline of an invasion. They gave their country time to think, prepare, and survive. And sometimes, that's the difference between a nation falling and a nation enduring. History is filled with massive battles and famous generals. Yet again and again, the moments that truly shift the future often begin in places no one expects. a remote island, an outnumbered force, a decision made at dawn by people who know they won't see sunset. Tsushima was one of those moments. Not a victory, a turning point. Because legends aren't always born from triumph. Sometimes they're born from choosing to fight anyway. And maybe that's why this story still resonates today. Not because most of us will ever face an invading army, but because we all understand what it feels like to face something bigger than ourselves. A moment where walking away is easier, safer, more logical. And a quiet voice inside asks whether standing firm might matter more. The samurai of Tsushima answered that question with their lives. Their names may not all be remembered. Their battlefield is quiet now. But the ripple of their choice helped shape the survival of a nation and proved that even a doomed stand can become an immortal story. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more incredible moments where small decisions change the course of history, make sure you're subscribed and stick around for the next video. Because the past is full of hidden turning points, and some of them are even more unbelievable than this one.